So, welcome to another School of Alevism video. We are here at Westminster University. It is a pleasure to actually meet for the first time Professor Ayfer Karakaya-Stump, and we're here at a conference on Alevi studies. There are Alevis and Alawites. Maybe if we start by talking about, is there a difference? And what is that difference?
Right. Okay, so purely semantically, both the word Alevi and Alawite come from the same Arabic word, Alawi. Alevi is the Turkified form of Alawi, and then Alawite is the anglicized form of Alawi, which means, followers of Ali. There are alternative names, obviously, given to these two groups, which are, they share a number of things in common, but they're also, at the same time, should be recognized as having distinctive cultural, religious, and historical traits, as well as historical origins. The alternative names obviously include, Kızılbaş and Nusayri, which over time has been kind of more or less avoided or not used by members of the communities due to the fact that these names over time acquired a derogatory meaning, and unfairly so. Like, for example, Nusayri comes from Muhammad ibn al-Nusayr, who was a scholar of religion, and he was a close disciple or student of the 10th and 11th Imams. And he is sort of, the group is named after him because they follow his teachings, but it was not him who sort of systematized the Alawite, I'll stick to that, the Alawite theology, but it was a number of scholars who sort of succeeded one another, who systematized his teachings and expanded them, including Hasibi. Hasibi is sometimes recognized as the real founder, and in fact, sometimes the Alawites are also called Hasibi Alevis, like Hasibi Alawites, so like with reference to Hasibi.
And just time-wise, when were they alive?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Muhammad ibn al-Nusayr lived in the 9th century, and then Hasibi, 10th century, and then Tabarani, Jilli. So there's a period, the formative period of the Alevi tradition basically dates back to the period between the 9th and 12th centuries. And we say this on the basis of these medieval works, theological works, very sophisticated theological discussions by these founding fathers that have survived to the present from medieval times. And let me also add that these figures, these founding fathers of the Alawite tradition, including first and foremost Hasibi, but others as well, they were real serious scholars, well-educated, and contrary to what some people might assume, they actually lived in cities. It was only over time that the Alawite community became geographically marginalized as a survival mechanism, that they took refuge in the Latakia region, in the mountains regions, and then kind of got disconnected from the more learned centers of the, particularly Syria and Iraq, right? And then, of course, the Alevis of Anatolia, maybe we can, distinguish sort of terminology-wise. I think Anatolian Alevis versus Alawites, Alevis versus Alawites. I think one thing that should be maybe emphasized here, which might clarify a lot of things, is that while the Alawite tradition, the formative period was the sort of the medieval period, late medieval era, sort of 9th to 12th centuries, more specifically, 10th and 11th. When we talk about the Anatolian Alevi tradition, it's a later tradition. Like when we talk about it as, when did it sort of emerge as we know it today? Like when did it consolidate into what we know as Alevism today? Then we have to really push the time frame further into the late 15th century and 16th centuries. And one sort of easy way to sort of demonstrate this is when you look at the canon, the Alawite canon and the Alevi canon. The Alawite canon includes figures like Hasibi, like they are the figures of veneration and pantheon and so on. So these are medieval figures from Syria and Iraq, whereas when you come to the Anatolian Alevis, in our case, the figures of veneration are mostly Sufi figures or poets, Sufi poets, and I mean, you can maybe start the story in the 13th century Anatolia with Hacı Bektaş and so on, but like Hatay, Pir Sultan, Kulimet, Virani, those figures lived around the turn of the 16th century. So it's at that point that we can talk about a full-fledged, emergence and consolidation of the Alevi, Anatolian Alevism tradition as we know it today.
Alevis and Alawites. How about, what's the difference with the transfer of information in the community? So,
transfer of information, yeah. Okay. Mode of transmission, yeah.
How is that different?
Good question. Well, first of all, let me explain sort of another important, meaningful difference between the two traditions, and then that will help us also understand the differences in the mode of transmission of the Alevi, knowledge and identity and so on. Of course, acknowledging that there are important overlaps, phenomenologically speaking at least, like between the two traditions in terms of their Alevism and esotericism and mysticism and so on. Obviously, there are a lot of overlaps, and also in modern times, politically, the political alignment and so on. So aside from those commonalities,
goes without saying.
That goes without saying. Theologically speaking, Anatolian Alevism is more of a mystical, is based on a mystical theology and mystical experiences, like Sufism, right? Mystical experiences, individual communion with the divine and internal search of the divine and so on. And of course that goes with a monistic understanding of the divine, which says that the divine is infused in all creation, so God is everywhere, right? In the material world as well. And then in the Alawite tradition, it's not the mystical experience per se, but it's the gnosis, the divine knowledge that's at the center. So you achieve communion with God, union with God, if you will. Well, not union. No. That doesn't exist.
There's a divide.
Yeah, there's a divide. Yes, but the way you interact with the divine, or you get to know the divine, is through acquiring this gnosis, the divine knowledge, which is transmitted through Ali, for example, who appears in human form. But he is actually the bringer of this divine gnosis, right? In the Alawite tradition, so let me go a little bit further in terms of theological differences. So the Alevi tradition is a monistic tradition, more mystical in terms of its emphasis, like in terms of its, like the way you experience the divine, versus the Alawite tradition. It emphasizes gnosis, and that is also related to it being a Gnostic and dualistic tradition, which means, so in Gnosticism, in all the Gnostic traditions, there is this belief in the duality of things, meaning there is the material world and there is the spiritual world. So that's the opposite of the monistic worldview, right? So in the Alawite tradition, the spiritual world and the material world are not only separate, but the material world is imperfect, right? And it's the cause of all evil, right? And then the goal is to reach the salvation, if you will, or the spiritual realm by acquiring this gnosis, this divine knowledge, and Ali, divine knowledge, and Ali is the source of it. But let me explain just a tiny bit here, because there are some the way some people put the Alawite understanding of like who is Ali, is very simplistic and misses a lot of the nuances. the fundamental question here is, what is the relationship between the divine and the created world? Well, this is sort of a big question for religions, right? How do we explain the relationship? Is there a relationship?
Yeah, and it becomes especially like a huge topic in early Christianity.
In early Christianity, as well as in early Islam. The problem is, as orthodoxies form and consolidate, these questions, as well as their discussion, is repressed, right? And the orthodoxies, they pretend as if they have resolved all these issues, but not really, because some of these issues are not easy to resolve, right? In Orthodox Islam, this issue is, they want to give the impression of having resolved this issue by sacralizing the Quran as the word of God, right? That's how the divine connects with the created world. God sends prophets, but for some interesting reason, Muhammad is the last prophet, and that actual book is what is sacralized, right? That's the only connection. That's the only connection, right? But there were a lot of groups, like the Sufis and the so-called Gulat groups. They said, wait, how can you, because in Orthodox Islam, the Quran is not just a book. It's the literal word of God, co-eternal with God, because there was a big debate in early Islam. Is the Quran a creation by God? If you say it's a creation by God, then that would sort of lower the value, right?
Smaller thing than this infinite
thing
somehow.
So the Orthodox position is that the Quran is co-eternal with God, so it's not created at any given point any point in history. So it's literally elevating it to the level of divine, right? Whereas in a lot of movements that are regarded heretical, that came to be suppressed, the idea was, wait, why should God stop communicating with its creature, with the created world? And then this idea that the divinity is always present in this world, that it's not like ontologically separate, completely separate, but also, okay, so I'm now done, I sent the Quran, and then now I go and take a nap, kind of a thing, right? No, they say, there is always a presence of divinity in this world. The question is, how, in what form? Now, in the monistic, the Wahdat al-Wujud is, okay, so it's infused everywhere. God is, is manifest in all of its creation. Whereas in the dualistic understanding, in the Alawite tradition, because the material world and the spiritual world are completely, entirely separate, right? It would be blasphemous to think that the material world is infused with divinity. They have to be separate, because the material world is the lower world. It's evil, right? So the divinity is in the pure nur, light, in the spiritual realm. But there has to be some communication. So how is that communication realized? The divinity, the divine, should appear to people in a form that will be comprehensible by the people, because people, our perceptions are limited, right? We are human beings. Even in Orthodox Islam, why is it that God does not speak to us directly? There's a written word, right? I mean, so there's always some intermediary, right? There has to be, because human, the idea is that God is so, glorious, or beyond any kind of human imagination. There is no way that there can be direct contact. Okay, so in Orthodoxy, it's the Quran, the written word. In the Alawite tradition, and theologically, they are very consistent. Actually, they say the divine appears in human form throughout history. Okay, there are 7 historical periods, but it's not that those figures are actually humans who are regarded as divine. They appear as human. They speak the human language, because that's the only way people can comprehend. And it's a very universalizing tradition as well, because they consider the ancient Greek philosophers, for example,
as incarnations,
archetypes. There are 7. They have 7 periods, and I can't remember all the sort of archetypal figures at this point, but definitely like the ancient Greek philosophers, and there are usually 3 figures that they single out as kind of symbolizing this divine triad, right? Like Ali, in Islamic period, it's Ali, Salman Farsi, Ali Muhammad and Salman Farsi, right? But then there are replications of these in earlier prophetic, you know, like when earlier prophets came, like Musa came with, you know, whatever, you know. So, but then it goes all the way to the ancient Greek and Persian sages and philosophers. So but then ultimately what they're saying is it's the same divine essence that keeps appearing in human form and communicating this gnosis, knowledge about the divine and about reality. And it's only by reflecting on this question and by sort of understanding, acquiring this gnosis, that you reach salvation. And you can't do that through just mystical experience. It's not just a high thing. It's literally knowledge, right? Okay, so your original question was, how is knowledge transmitted? That's why I sort of gave you this whole sort of very long introduction. So in the Alevi tradition, usually knowledge is transmitted through poetry, through music, sema. Oh, by the way, let me also add this. There's one thing that a lot of people are curious about, and there's a lot of baseless speculation about it, but it can be explained on the basis of what I just said. Women are not included in the, it's also part of the answer, actually. So women are not, all young men are educated. This gnosis is transmitted, but depending on their level of progress, of course. But every young man that reaches the age of like early teens, they select a mentor for themselves, right? Uncle, they call it uncle, like emmi, right? Uncle. And they go and live with that person who's knowledgeable about the Alawite theology, this gnosis, right? And they get trained. They usually spend, depending on the time period, you know, like nowadays probably it's shorter, maybe a couple of weeks, but maybe in earlier times it was longer. So they live with their mentor and they learn these, whatever that knowledge is, usually, you know, in the form of prayers and so on, but then they don't preserve it in written form. They write it down, they memorize it, and then they destroy what is written. But women are not included in this whole process. Women are not transmitted the gnosis. And the reason for that has nothing to do with the Arab culture or whatever, because that's usually how it's explained. No, it has to do with the fact that women are associated with the material world because of their reproductive capacities, and the spiritual world and the material world ought to remain separate. So I guess one difference in terms of transmission of knowledge is, number one, it's only transmitted to men.
In Alawites.
In the Alawite case. And it's literally, you know, in the form of actual transmission of certain textual, prayers and so on, and you have to memorize it. So it's, but of course, that doesn't mean that everybody who goes through this initial mentorship knows everything about the Alawite tradition, because it's an esoteric tradition, meaning everybody, like there are grades, right, levels, and also in the Alawite tradition there are levels, and you sort of have to acquire the gnosis depending on how progress you are on the spiritual path. So it's, it takes time. In the Anatolian Alevi tradition, it's usually through music, through sema, because for us the body is not evil. The body can also be the vehicle through which we sort of explore divinity. So body is not evil, right? It can be vehicle for good or evil, because sema is, so your body helps, the music helps, hearing the music helps explore the divinity and so on. But ultimately, and they tell stories, and ultimately, your spirit is almost educated, right? I mean, there is no specific piece of text that's being transmitted to you, like in the Alawite tradition. It's an overall kind of state of being. Right, but it's really magical, right? I mean, it's the high that matters in mystical traditions, as opposed to these more, gnosis-based, like dual, in mystical traditions, it's this spiritual self-exploration and so on, and the Alevi rituals do that. We don't realize how. Sometimes it's difficult for us to kind of articulate it in a way that other people will understand. It's because of the nature of these mystical traditions. It's not something that you write down in prose and these are the principles. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely this important emphasis on there is something that is ineffable, and it's okay that something is ineffable.
Exactly.
Because not everything needs to be understood through just words, through just language. Which is why poetry plays a part, because poetic philosophy does something different than just like a story, right? A story has sort of structure that is fitting to our mental faculties, but poetic philosophy is different because it induces something in you, induces an emotion.
Right.
So this ineffable aspect is really interesting. And maybe a nice comparison is maybe there's like a different sort of weight is put on existence and essence between Alevis and Alawites. Maybe the argument could be that essence is more important for the Alawites. This kind of, you can link this back to like ancient Greek philosophy. I guess you can link it to Plato as the sort of the person who symbolized this the most. Of the essence of the thing is really important, and it's distinct from the real world. The Platonic world is distinct from this real world. While with an Alevism, existence, right? It's the being, and that act is sort of the key aspect of Alevism, and that is something difficult to describe, and you mature the more you experience it, the more you're sort of in contact with it.
Right, and also, but in both traditions, actually, this is true. Divinity in its totality is still beyond comprehension, right? Sometimes in our Anatolian Alevi tradition, they say, "Oh, Enel Hak, we believe God, we are God." That's not understanding the whole story here, right? I mean, it doesn't mean that you are divinity in its totality, right? You're just sort of, there's a piece of divinity. You're, infused. There's a divine part of you, internally, microcosm, macrocosm, like the entire universe as macrocosm is also found in us as human beings with all the different layers. So evil is in us, so like when we say Enel Hak, doesn't mean that, oh, Ali is God, like that's just very, what's the word that I'm looking for?
I mean, I guess the key thing is to not get confused by the implications of saying I am God with power. It's not granting you power over something. You don't suddenly have dominion over your surroundings just because you understand divinity, but it's realizing it equalizes in a sense, as opposed to creating a hierarchy between you and the rest of the world.
Yes, well, not spiritually though, because spiritually there are, but ultimately what that tells us is if there is a part of divinity within us, we can always discover that aspect of ourselves and kind of try to explore divinity, the broader, like Vahdet-i Vücut, right? How diversity, there's actually a unity within diversity, but basically you explore the divine by reaching out to that divine aspect of yourself to kind of try and reflect on it and maybe try to comprehend the larger picture, but you can never fully comprehend it. But ultimately, the gem rituals and the bağlama and the poetry is, like you said, it kind of stimulates this kind of exploration, and it encourages you, but it's never fully resolved, right? Aşk is this search. That's why when you listen to a deyish, we feel inspired, but oftentimes we can't even describe what it is that we are feeling, right? So that's aşk. So you explore individually. There's this also very individualistic aspect of the Alevi mystical traditions and the Alevi tradition. In the Alawite tradition, first of all, again, we couldn't get into a lot of details, but they have a very complicated cosmology. different layers, like the spiritual world, the material world, and then there are emanations, levels of emanations from the spiritual world. They're all well defined with names and so on, and I can't get into a lot of details right now.
In the sense of like they decide, they say, okay, this has been discovered and this is what it is.
Exactly.
That's what the Alawites
right.
have in their tradition.
In that sense, there's gnosis, there's knowledge. Yeah, I think we can probably, if that's enough, you know. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
So there's two things. So in philosophy, we would ask, we're interested in asking the question of, okay, you say you know something, how do you know? How do you get to know?
Right.
And
Epistemology.
Yeah, and in a sense, okay, we answered this with regards to Alawites and Alevis. But then the other thing is, okay, what we want to know in these traditions is the truth, hakikat or something like this. Is that different with Alawites? Or like, what's the hakikat, perception of hakikat?
Okay, well, yeah. this is very, very good question. I don't know if I can fully answer it. I can, based on my limited understanding, I should say, I guess I can try to respond. So how do we know what we know, right? So we know that in Orthodox religions, based on revelation, they say you can only know through these written revelations, right? I mean, that's the source of real knowledge, hakikat, right? Yeah. That's the Orthodox position. That's also true for in Christianity and
you have a moment of spiritual awakening, or you know, a single moment of revelation to you.
But of course, the problem with that is, I mean, we are not here to critique the Orthodox position necessarily, but what about the times when there was no writing, right? I mean, clearly these religions are, they're reflective of their times in the sense that they emerge at a time when urbanization was happening and writing became really important and so on and so forth, right? Whereas the Alawite tradition and you know, like the more mystical traditions kind of are more consistent in that sense, and in that they say, you know, the divine communicates with us through other means, right? And we know what we know through these figures, right? Like in the Alawite tradition, like I said, you know, there are 7 historical periods, and there are always these archetypal figures who kind of, you know, eventually, you know, it will sort of emerge as Ali, right? But you know, all these earlier figures were actually the same Ali, right? So we learned from them. So I guess you can say we learned from, I mean, of course they wouldn't say sages, but kind of sage, right? Saintly figures, right? They wouldn't use that term, obviously, for Ali, right? But definitely there is a similarity in the sense that in the Alawite tradition, in mystical traditions, in Sufism, you know, you see the hakikat. Okay, so still the sages, you know, wisdom, you know, those are important. But in the Alevi tradition, you see through your gönül gözü. So it's again this personal, internal self-reflection and exploration and communion with God and so on. So that's how you really ultimately understand the true hakikat. You know, you look at the world through the gönül gözü. Of course, you need a mürşid and so on and so forth. But ultimately, it's, you know, the Sufi, you know, the source of knowledge is this inner, you know, self-reflection. In the Alawite tradition, again, these figures play a role, right? But they bring the gnosis more directly, if you will. Like so like in the Alevi tradition, in the Sufi tradition, these sages, these saints, they are actually individuals who have achieved higher levels of spiritual progress, right, through internal exploration and whatnot, okay? And then we can learn from their wisdom, and then we can also try to develop our own sort of inner eye, right? In the Alawite tradition, you know, we already said that there is a similar respect for human figures, but it's a slightly different way of transmitting the hakikat.
What about, I guess, maybe an interesting difference of relevance is like the gem ceremonies. Like, what are the differences there?
In the Alawite tradition, I think that's one of the biggest sort of differeces. The ritual is different. Women are not included. We said that before. They have batini namaz, so esoteric prayer. So like In Cem we have halka namazı, theoretically speaking, but they specifically have batini namaz, which, as far as I know, again, the Alawites are much more sort of protective of their tradition, and that comes partly from the esoteric, like more pronounced esoteric tendencies in the sense that, don't share this with people who are ignorant, right? Only allow people who can actually understand and comprehend. So there's the esoteric aspect, but also survival mechanism, right? Definitely. The survival, the Alawites have been probably oppressed even more than the Anatolian Alevis, and we can get into that if you want. But like the Anatolian Alevis, at least since the 1990s, have been sort of doing their gems openly. It's not as secretive, obviously, and they don't. So as far as I know, again, I was not part of an Alawite ritual, obviously, which they do, like they have many bayrams, holidays, festivals, like every month there's something, right? Even more frequently. And then they have these batini namaz, they gather in people's houses, in private houses, and everything. I was never part of that because, obviously I'm not a member of the community, but also I'm a woman. But based on what I know, they have batini namaz, which is silent. So it's sort of self-reflection, and I think, and also some level of recitations from the verses of the Quran. I think they used to also recite poetry, maybe more in the past, but nowadays it's less. Versus the gems of the Anatolian Alevis, as we all know, it's very much centered around sort of artistic expressions of music and dance and I think we don't really need to go into a lot of details about that. The Quranic recitations are obviously not as prevalent, not nearly as prevalent. There are some recitation of the Nur ayati when you're lighting the candle.
Making a wish or
but beyond that, the prayers are obviously not from the Quran or in Arabic for the most part. There might be Arabic phrases, but it's mostly like gulbanks and so on in Turkish. So that's another big. Obviously, we didn't say this, but I assume everybody knows that the language of the Alawite tradition is Arabic. The language of the Anatolian Alevis, at least in the ritual space, it seems like Turkish has been dominant. We know that in the past they used Kurdish and Zazaki in gem rituals as well. But that said, the poetry with the mahlas seems to have been always in Turkish. So there is also that difference.
I guess there's also a distinction to an important point to make of the day-to-day as compared to moments of religious worship. Like for example, starting with the Alevis, there's obviously a difference between what Alevis are doing within the gem and how they are being an Alevi in their day-to-day. Because we get asked this question a lot of, a young person will be like, how does an Alevi do this? How does an Alevi do that? Because what they're really asking is, okay, I've gone to a gem ceremony, so I have the data of what a gem ceremony is. But my life isn't a gem ceremony. My life is this. So what does it mean to be an Alevi, in the outside world? And what are the moments of worship that I can have as an Alevi in the outside world? And you may say something like giving a lokma, so going to a gem event and just giving food, sharing charity work. If there's a ziyaret nearby, going to a ziyaret, again giving a lokma. So some communal activities like that. And then you may say something like, well, the music, listening to that music and feeling something. That is a moment of you to have this sort of worship. Sure, Semah, I think it's never done on one's own. So, but that's a communal thing. So you can kind of point to stuff like this. And I guess the question is, what about for Alawites? Could you, or do you know of what their day-to-day worship is, or the individual, so not within the teaching or so not talking about how it's transmitted now, but just on the personal basis of the people.
Yeah, well, again, obviously, I'm sure there are people out there who would answer this question much better than I do. But I visited Samandağ multiple times. I have very close friends, and By the way, let me just say one thing about the not including women in the ritual space. In social life, that doesn't mean that women are excluded, right? I mean, I want to underline that in social life, women are no less included and respected as in the Alevi tradition. Let me just add that just for correctness. So in terms of how they experience being an Alawite, first of all, let me say this, and this is also true for the Alevis. Being an Alevi or an Alawite is fundamentally, it has something to do with how you position yourself in this world, okay? As esoteric traditions, and I think here we also see kind of a resonance with leftist ideologies as well. This idea that the majority will never really see or accept hakikat, right? That people who will be able to see the hakikat and accept it and stand for it will always be in the minority. So what I'm saying, this is, I know this is not exactly what you asked, but I think it's relevant, right? Because it's relevant in the sense that how does how does it impact your day-to-day life? And I'm saying there is a huge impact in the sense that both an Alawite or an Alevi, their self-positioning in this world is very much a matter of, standing up for a difficult position that's not very popular, that the majority will never accept, right? And kind of sticking to the hakikat, to what you believe is hakikat, and preserving your Alevi and Alawite identity. And that, it is reflected in so many aspects of our lives, in our political choices, in the way we sort of try to be honest or whatever, right?
So it's just linked to like the concept of sir. Like maybe this is of like there is a secret, and a secret is something that just just definition-wise, right? It's something that is between individuals, that is not everyone. Right? Like if everybody knows it, it's no longer a secret.
Right, and also not everybody can appreciate the like if you tell. Here's an interesting anecdote from my own sort of field work. I knew this Dede, and the way he explained to me what Alevism was and all that, it was very much kind of like interpreting everything symbolically and so on. But then I read an interview, this was many, many years ago, an interview of him, like with him, published in this, I don't know, was it Türklük Araştırmaları Hacı Bektaş or something? And then like the way he talked in that interview was very surprising, because he kind of emphasized how, like, oh, Şeriat hepimizin, that sort of stuff, like how like Şeriat, we should all be bound by Şeriat, which, like both the Alawite and the Alevi tradition, I think, theologically, one commonality is, this either a symbolic or esoteric interpretation of Şeriat, or completely seeing Şeriat as something that is only for the masses, for the ignorant masses, and kind of, not caring or not feeling bound by Şeriat. That's a commonality. But anyway, so like this Dede, later on when I saw him, I said, Dede, like the way you gave this interview, I was really surprised, because I never heard you like sort of emphasize Şeriat. And then his answer to me was, bebeğin ağzına pirzola verilmez. Okay, so basically, like these guys, spiritually speaking, are like bebeks. If I give them pirzola, they will suffocate, or they won't be. So basically, this idea of like keeping a secret is very much part of this esoteric mindset, right? Not everybody can understand everything, just kabına göre, right? I mean, you can only take as much as your spiritual progress or whatever intellectual capacity allows. You can't just tell everybody the same thing. But in terms of other sort of, like, what does being an Alevi mean? First of all, actually recently somebody sent me a message. He said, as Alevis, do we have any individual prayers, like the namaz that people do? Well, first of all, the forms, the outward forms do not matter, obviously, right? That's the whole idea, right? Because Şeriat is all about form, right? So you can turn internally and pray and, try to sort of I don't know, like whatever is in you, like reach out to your divine aspects, deal with your ego, whatever. And you don't need a particular form for it. You don't need a particular space. So you can do the prayers. And I'm sure, and this is true for the Alevis, that is also true for the Alawites probably. But I have heard from other people, from my Alawite friends, that they can also recite some of these prayers that they have been transmitted. But beyond that, for the Alawites, really it's the holidays, it's the festivals. The Alawite calendar of festivals, it's incredibly long. Like there is something like every week, every month, and they have, and there is a great deal of misunderstanding about the Alawite tradition here. It's very much, I think it's a big bias too. So they celebrate certain festivals. But first of all, they celebrate Islamic and specifically Alawite festivals, like Gadirgum, for example, but others as well, and Kurban Bayramı, Eid al-Fitr, whatever. But they also celebrate festivals that overlap, like with the Christian Christmas and Easter, okay, and then some Zoroastrian holidays. And so on the based on this, some scholars, well, not some scholars, traditionally they said, oh, this is a syncretism. So they have been influenced by the Christians and the Zoroastrians, and they have adapted
They're
and
combining
created
everything
this.
just because
But
they can.
that's actually a misrepresentation, because from an internal perspective, remember what I said about how, throughout history, there's always divinity in this world in some human form, whether it's a philosopher or a prophet. So basically, this is a very universalizing tradition in the sense that, all these religious and philosophical traditions, they all share and, represent the same hakikat. So celebrating their festivals is only, like all these different festivals, is simply manifesting this understanding that they all hold the same truth. Plus, I should also add that the way they celebrate these Zoroastrian or Christian holidays are different. They put their own stamp on these festivals. But right, so I think that's probably the biggest sort of ritual thing, for the Alawites is celebrating these holidays.
The conference is just having their lunch. Conference attendees are just having their lunch break right now, so we'll slowly
Wrap up.
But I mean, there's so much to discuss, and again, we focus, like, if you like, on the differences in theology and practice between Alawites and Alevis. But then there's the historical difference, right? And there's a different historical
starting point. Maybe?
Starting point, a different story that these communities have
Right.
lived through.
Right.
So maybe, what are sort of the key points to mention there?
Okay, that's good. Well, first of all, I kind of mentioned a little bit the fact that the Alawite tradition is an older tradition, right? It goes to the 9th, 10th, 11th centuries, and so on. But in terms of its historical context, they emerged from within early Alid movements, pro-Alid movements, like in Kufa, for example. I mean, we can establish a direct connection through their literature and through their figures of veneration, a direct connection with the early Alid movements in Kufa and Baghdad. Okay, so it's very clear when you read their literature and so on. And probably the Alawites are the only surviving group today with a direct historical connection to these early pro-Alid movements. Even the Shia, I mean, there is this misconception that these groups are branched out of Shiism. This idea that, there was always this one Shiism and all these groups all set, and then they just branch out, they are offshoots. It's actually exactly the opposite, because the early Alid movements, they were very esoteric, very, debated so many different issues. There was no fixed orthodoxy. And then Shi'i orthodoxy, Shi'i legalistic orthodoxy, developed out of this early Alid movements. in large part under the influence of Sunni legal orthodoxy. They developed their own Sharia-centered legal tradition. So it's actually the mainstream Twelver Shiism that branched out, if you will, and sort of consolidated itself into a legalistic tradition.
And it's maybe like a political thing that's happening here, like in response to situations, you know, on the ground, so to speak.
You mean like how, why this
like,
orthodoxy?
Yeah.
Well, it's definitely, there's political, the development of this Shi'i legalistic tradition took place during times when the Shia took power, like under the Buyids. Sorry, I was thinking about the Turkish word. Under the Buyids, for example, when the Abbasid Caliphate came under Buyid control, and that was a Shi'i, or at least Alid dynasty, and they supported the Shia. So when you establish a state, right, you want to institutionalize this, you want to put limits to what can be said about religion, you know. So politics plays a huge role here. You want to fix things. You don't want to have all these very provocative debates about hakikat and, you know, like how do we know what we know? How do we communicate with the divine? No, you want to fix it. So I think definitely the emergence of Shi'i polities, dynasties played an important role. The Buyids, starting with the Buyids, and then of course, you know, with this, you know, we come all the way to the Safavids, you know, and so on. The Alevi movement, as I also say in my book, emerged from out of the more esoteric currents within Sufism that have been repressed, marginalized by what came to be known as mainstream Sufism. That too is a later development. Early Sufism included so many different currents, really, you know, like speculations about so many different things, wild ideas, right? I mean, there were vegetarian, vegan Sufis, and, you know, like everything. But eventually, they developed a mainstream Sufism that reconciled itself with the ulama and with the Shariat and Zahiri and so on. And all these other early currents came to be marginalized. So parallel to what happened in the case of Alid movements, like the Alawis being marginalized, you can think of the Alevi Sufism as also, you know, one of these early currents that have been marginalized and eventually repressed. But let me say one other thing, and then maybe we can conclude. So these two communities, you know, despite these sort of differences in history and theology, they share one thing in common that kind of has shaped them in so many different ways, their psychologies, their experiences and so on, which is, you know, persecution as heretics. Very severe persecution as heretics. The Alawite, in the case of the Alawites, it starts earlier with like the infamous fatwas of Ibn Taymiyyah. They're horrifying, and this guy, you know, like he himself, this was on during the Mamluks. He himself participated in these campaigns, and these people, they were, you know, just peasants, right? I mean, they weren't doing anything, right? But sometimes Islamic polities, they persecute these groups simply to prove how orthodox they are, right? I mean, to legitimize themselves. The Alevis, so by the time you come to the 16th century, fatwas similar to Ibn Taymiyyah's were then given for the Alevis, and in the 19th century, both for Alawites and Alevis. And that really very much shaped their experiences politically, socially, economically. They were marginalized. You know, we have the same actually storyline in the case of the Alevis. We think of the Alevis as like perennially rural and impoverished. That's not true. It's something that happened over time, right? There's this spatial marginalization, economic marginalization we see in both cases. So when we come to the modern period, of course, the memory of persecution, we shouldn't even say the memory, because persecutions continued in the 19th century, it picks up and so on. So by the time we come to the modern era, in the sense that, you know, like the time when nation states emerge, both groups act very similarly. Both groups in modern times, with the emergence of nation states, they embrace secular nationalist ideologies or leftist ideologies, okay? Like in Syria, they embrace the Ba'athist ideology, and in Turkey they embrace, Kemalist, CHP, whatever ideology, or leftist ideologies, in both countries. And they do so at the expense of their own identities. They are willing to repress their identities as Alawites or Alevis to be accepted by the community. They hope that through these secular ideologies they can finally integrate with the larger society and move away from the stigmatization and religious scrutiny and so on. They invest so much hope and they dedicate themselves, right, to these ideologies. I mean, in Syria, of course, the situation is slightly different in the sense that since the Assad family came to power, it's actually a very sad story because, as Father Assad, he kind of foregrounded Shiism and claiming that Alevis were part of the Shia. His son Bashar Assad, he actually very much tried to appeal to even the Salafi Sunnis by appointing Salafis to important places and so on. And at the same time, see, the Assad family, they allowed other religious sects and communities, about 17 I believe, they gave them the right to self-organize and have their own parliament, except the Alawites. The Alawites never had an organization of their own, and today they are still experiencing the pitfalls of that, right? The Alawites were not allowed to form a parliament, were never allowed to have their own organization, were not even allowed to kind of reveal their religious distinctiveness. But when I was in Syria, when Hafiz Assad was in power, I was naive enough to go and ask people, are you an Alawi, and I remember still like how the reaction was, wait, what, it was such a taboo, even more so than in Turkey. But so basically my point is, in both cases, they suppressed. They wanted to become invisible. They suppressed their own sort of distinctive religious identities for the sake of being accepted and integrated into the nation. But it backfired so badly. In Syria, it's horrible. Like when I talk to the Alawites from Syria, I mean, it's a sad story. And in Turkey, I think, obviously it's not nearly as dramatic and so on, but in Turkey, I think there is a similar thing happening in the sense that the Alevis are also kind of starting to question this sort of dedication to secular nationalism, or even leftist movements, or even secular Kurdish nationalism, like Turkish nationalism definitely, because they are sort of suddenly realizing, wait, we want to forget that we are Alevis, but they're not forgetting it. It keeps coming back somehow.
Well, maybe there's this interesting point of, with nation states, there's the possibility maybe in people's minds of, like, now we are going to be a part of this wider structure that we live in. Because
but you have to still suppress your distinctiveness.
Because I guess the other thing is, it's not like, maybe some people have the idea, which maybe is important to highlight, of it's only in one particular era that Alevis or Alawites suffered. Like, they only suffered in this era, but they didn't in this. Like, some people will say it was actually the Ottoman Empire. That's where we really suffered, and then we didn't here, right? So, but it's not so clearly demarcated.
Oh,
right?
absolutely not.
And the oppression of the identity of these people is continuous throughout history.
Absolutely.
But the possibility of being active within the wider world, a world which is now opening up, like it's an important thing to realize. Of nation states it's not just a political change of power, it's a change in the way you view the world, a fundamental sort of retelling of every aspect of your life. It's a qualitative transformation in what the world means to you as well, because now the world is made up of these very well-defined things that work together to provide services, etc. And this is very different to feudal life, or imperial life, if you like, under the empire. And I think that's an important sort of point to make.
Recently I wrote an article about comparing sectarianism in Turkey and in the larger Islamic world to racism in the Western world. I mean, it's very unfortunate that the academia that works on the Islamic world, and also people who live in Muslim majority countries, academics included, they don't talk about sectarianism. It's a taboo subject, right? Similar to how academics have been talking about racism in Western countries. No, we don't talk about that. That's partly because of the how this, critique of Orientalism has devolved into sort of like apologetics of Islam, like you never, oh, it's all, like this idea in the scholarship is that, oh, sectarianism is a modern colonial concept. There is no such thing, right? It's all the Western, it's not, that's not the case, right?
So very postmodern view.
Yeah. So, and that's sort of that's an unfortunate aspect of otherwise a very mind-opening critique of sort of Western literature, whatnot. But it has also prevented people from looking at these sorts of like things like sectarianism within the Islamic world. Said never talks about it, right? I mean, so anyway, I wrote an article about a week ago. Actually, it was not published in any of the leftist venues, which published my articles willingly earlier, and it's because my main argument is that just like racism is not only limited to the right-wing groups in the West, there's racism in veiled forms, in soft forms, among other sort of supposedly more progressive and leftist and liberal sections of the Western societies. The same is true for sectarianism in Turkey, and I think the Kılıçdaroğlu debate, seçilemez aday, definitely was a code, right, for him being an Alevi, and it was very much embraced by our supposedly very progressive, very left-wing. It was Ahmet Şık, the head of the TİP party, who first said, well, Kılıçdaroğlu has to realize that him being an Alevi is a big mesele, big question for the people in Turkey. So in that article, I argue that sectarianism is very much sort of like racism. It's deeply internalized. It's a deeply internalized socio-political hierarchy, right? And that hierarchy assumes that, on the one hand, the whites have to be at the top. That's the normal order of things. But when that order is somehow violated, like in the US, because Barack Obama was elected, I think part of Trump's comeback is a backlash to that. Because, how can a black person rule over the white people, right? I mean, people wouldn't articulate it in those terms, but some of them would actually as well.
Some now would, yeah.
Some would. Very much like a similar dynamic you see in Turkey. The normal, internalized, normalized socio-political hierarchy is that Sunni Muslims, I mean, of course, there are no non-Muslims anymore in the country. So, of course, Muslims and Sunni Muslims should be at the top, right? Like Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu's candidacy created so much controversy and I think very unfair sort of attacks on him because, an Alevi, even being the candidate for presidency, kind of turns upside down this whole internalized socio-political and religious hierarchy. How can a heretic, an Alevi, you guys are young, maybe you don't feel it as directly as I do, but it's such a strong feeling among the Sunnis, how dare, know your place. We are tolerating you, but that's, the condition here is that you'll know your place, So back to your comment, you said, a nation state is a entirely different way of looking at the world. But when it comes to these deeply ingrained structural hierarchies and discriminations and so on, you can't just change these by changing the law. Okay, these are deeply ingrained cultural ideas. So yes, with the nation state, the ideal is that everybody will be treated equally, right? But you can change the laws, but in practice, there are so many other aspects to racism and sectarianism that it doesn't change. And I think that is the disappointment that both the Alevis and the Alawites in Syria felt. There was a time when they thought, okay, there's secularism now, we are all equal. Then they realized, wait, no, we're still not equal, right?
Yeah, the problem isn't changed. Like you may, like the underlying illness is still there. You may be taking painkillers, or you may be wearing different clothes. But if the underlying illness is still there, then that bias is always going to exist in society.
Right.
I guess is,
And yeah, that
which links to this why, even though the people in power in Syria, literally the family in power were Alawites, they were still
oh yeah.
not. I mean, their benefits to the Alawite community was near to none.
Absolutely.
Or negative, actually.
Yeah, negative, definitely. I mean, it's so unfair, and it's another sort of manifestation of sectarianism itself. You know, like the entire international media called the Assad period as the Nusayri regime, as if the Alawites were actually benefiting from it. That's an absolute BS, right? And maybe a small clique around Assad, which included, his own relatives, like in any authoritarian society, but not the larger Alawite society. But despite that, and I think it's a shame that the international supposedly, democratic, yeah, right. They kept calling the Syrian government the Nusayri regime, but and then when you question them on this, they say, well, because the Alawites are a minority, but well, first of all, the Alawites were not collectively in power, did not benefit from the regime. In fact, they lost a lot of things. But also, why did you not call Saddam, like you attacked Saddam Hussein as well, but nobody called Saddam Hussein a Sunni regime, even though the Sunnis form a minority in Iraq, right? This is sort of like shows how deeply ingrained these socio-political hierarchies are, even in the Western mind. Like the Sunnis being in power is a normal thing.
Maybe just to give like context, people may understand this of like, for example, how when today people talk about acts of terror, right? They may use, if the person perpetrating the act is from the Middle East, they'll say, oh, this, Iraqi, Syrian, whatever, carried out this terrorist attack, this, terrible attack, whatever. But if it's, I don't know, I forget, was it Andre Breivik in Norway? When he kills 90 people, he was displaying terrorist-like activities.
Right.
He's not a terrorist.
Right.
He's only so he's simulating what is the real problem, which is over here.
Language matters.
So yeah, it's connecting intimately the culture with the problem, and this isn't just specific to Alevis. It's a very general thing that needs to be pointed out. And so creating this negative association between Alawites and the Syrian regime is not sort of. I mean, okay, it misses the point, it misses all the nuance of what Alawites are, what they believe in, but it also harms their, if you believe in their emancipation, on whatever political level that may be for you, it harms that process entirely. I think it prevents them from participating even in sort of democracy, participating in society in a healthy way, and these things live on even when communities migrate. That experience is unique to, in the diaspora
even
as well.
in the diaspora, yep.
So that's an important
right.
The consequence of that is important.
Absolutely.
And it's why I think we want to talk about Alawites and Alevis.
So the question is, how do we deal with these deeply ingrained forms of discrimination, right? So in our case, sectarianism. In Turkey, as well as in Syria, like under the secular nationalist sort of ideological, hegemony, the solution was sought in not talking about these things, right? So in Turkey, I'm sure as soon as even in the media, when the issue comes up, even the most progressive ones, they say, well, I don't really want to talk about it. I think it's such a shame, we talk about his Alevi identity and, they definitely don't want to talk about sectarianism. Even our most progressive, most supposedly democratic academic, colleagues or politicians, it's a shame to talk about, Alevism. It's a shame to talk about sectarianism. It's backward. It's actually a way of avoiding the problem, right? I mean, if you are totally comfortable with people's Alevi identities, then you wouldn't even mind, right? I mean, okay, so you are from Denizli, I'm from Manisa, that's just a detail, and we can talk about Denizli and Manisa, no, but it won't bother anybody, right? If it's so disturbing to people still, that, when we say, okay, so I'm an Alevi, if it's still so disturbing, that means it's still a deep problem, right? People still, it's a problem. So the question is, are we going to solve this problem supposedly by not talking about it, which is what we have been encouraged to do? Don't talk about it. It's ayıp, right? Don't. Or, as I'm trying to do right now, what I'm saying is, experience has shown us, both in Syria and in Turkey and in other parts of the world, with racism as well as sectarianism, these problems don't just disappear by not talking about it. They don't get resolved. They just linger on, they live on, and people suffer, right? So what I'm suggesting is that, like with the issue of sectarianism, rather than shying away from it, rather than avoiding it, we should actually talk about it, write about it academically, and analyze it and explore it, because that's the only way that we can deal with it and hopefully bring it to an end. And let us finish by saying that there is still an ongoing genocide of Alawites in Syria. Unfortunately, the international media, nobody's paying any attention to it because the Alawites have no political weight. Nobody cares about them. But not only is there still an ongoing genocide, by the way, the numbers are really high, in the thousands. Now, international organizations are also acknowledging it. But another very sore issue is the abduction of women, Alawite women. Every day, Alawite women, a number of Alawite women are being abducted by the Islamist terrorists. And it's unfortunately, well, Reuters just 2 days ago actually had a piece about that. But I just want all of our listeners, if there is anybody out there, to please keep an eye on this. This is a humanitarian disaster, and it's an ongoing issue. So we should all be definitely be aware of it and pay attention. Thank you.
Definitely much more can be said and discussed, and should be, but hopefully this has been some kind of an introduction to some of the differences between Alawites and Alevis, and why, I guess we tried to explain why it's an important thing to talk about with regards to current events happening.
Yeah, and why it's important also, this is one question that comes up all the time, Alawites and Alevis. Sometimes when I talk about these historical and theological differences, cultural differences, they say, why are you separating the two groups? We are all Alevis. And then there's another group who says, we have nothing to do with them. Why should we care about them? I think both of these positions are wrong. I think we have common interests. We are being discriminated against on the basis of religion, our religious faith, and we share a lot in terms of our faiths as well. But that doesn't mean that we should disregard these nuances and our differences, and I think we should acknowledge the differences, if nothing else, out of respect for one another's distinctive traditions. So I want to make sure that people understand that correctly. This is not a way of kind of dividing the Alevis by any means, but it's respecting the differences, because exactly what the Islamic Orthodoxy does is it lumps together all these different groups into the same box, into the same basket that they call gulat. Gulat means, those beyond the pale. So for them, it doesn't matter what the nuances are. They don't care, but we should care. Okay, all right. Sorry, I keep saying it's the last word, but no, but this is good. I mean, because I think I said most of the things that I wanted to say. And remember, we talked about possibly doing something about the Arab Alawites, because their history is super interesting, and we know so much more about the details of their history. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.